Hello everyone, Silent K here with another card review. In case you haven't been keeping up, all 109 cards have been revealed through a Japanese magazine or something. As usual, I'm going to wait until they're on Darkness Evolved to review them because you get the official translations that way. But if you're interested, you can check out the official forums or the Reddit and get a link to the fan translations of those cards. But for now, we're going to review the 20 newest cards revealed on Darkness Evolved, in order of class as usual, with neutrals last. First up, Azazel for Bloodcraft. 8 mana 7/7 Fanfare, change both leaders' defense to 10, either by restoring defense or by dealing damage. What we have here is the double Alex Straza. A really powerful effect, especially for Bloodcraft, because usually when someone like me is playing against you, you're hovering around 14 health because your opponent wants to kill you in one shot, so you can't have access to your Vengeance abilities, which are very powerful comeback mechanics. So you put this in your late game Bloodcraft control/mid-range deck, and then even if your opponent is keeping you above Vengeance, you can just activate it yourself on turn 8. Of course, this is a double-edged sword. Lowering your health could allow them to combo you down, or you might have them below 10 health to begin with, in which case you would actually be healing them. But overall, the verdict is it's a very potent card, has a lot of potential, and I expect to see it played. Next up, Mini Soul Devil, 3 mana 3/2. Whenever another follower evolves, deal 1 damage to the enemy leader and restore 1 defense to your leader. I think last time I forgot to mention that these new when another follower evolves cards also include your opponent's evolves, so you can use them as a deterrent for keeping your opponent from evolving. But even with that said, most of these cards so far have been 2 costs, and even 3 costs comes before the evolving turns, and the ones we've seen so far don't have a very powerful effect, not a powerful enough effect to deter your opponent from evolving their own stuff. Like this one, you take 1 damage to evolve something, it's not a big deal. You're still going to do it to control the board. So the verdict is, it's a niche condition that's not really worth putting into a deck. You have better things to play for 3 mana. Weak card. And for Dragoncraft, we have Dragon Song Flute. An amulet for 3 mana, Fanfare, transform each card in your hand that costs 3 or less into a Hellflame Dragon if Overflow is active for you. And whenever you draw a card that costs 3 or less, transform that into a Hellflame Dragon as well. And Hellflame Dragon is a 2 mana 4/3 with Rush. Rush being the new ability, very much like the Evolve condition where you can attack right away but you can only attack minions. So for the most part, this is going to turn all your cheap cards into removal. If you can hit something with a 4/3 and have it stick around, then that's a bonus. So this is basically like an alternate Golden Dragon's Den. Golden Dragon's Den removes your cheap cards and lets you draw more cards so that you can hopefully improve your hand as the game goes on, have more expensive cards in the late game. Instead of cycling through your deck though, this one just straight up upgrades your cheap cards. There is the problem though that there are some good cheap cards in Dragoncraft that you might want to play late game regardless, like Ivory Dragon or Dragon Oracle for card draw, Wild Hunt for removal, Dragon Emissary for card draw, Imprisoned Dragon is a good ward. So this is a useful amulet, but it just works differently than Golden Dragon's Den. The verdict is, I can see this being a great card in decks that are tuned around it, but it's probably not something you just want to throw in any Dragoncraft deck. Next up, Dracomancer's Rites, another amulet for Dragoncraft. 3 mana, whenever you discard a card from your hand, draw a card. Much like Noxus Dragon, discard Dragoncraft could be a thing if there was more enablers for it. As of right now, there aren't very many reliable enablers. You just have the 1/2 Dragon Newt Scholar and Shenlong. Then there's also Golden Dragon's Den and Altered Fate for mass card draw. And also combine this with Golden Dragon's Den means you have 2 permanent amulets on your board. And combining this with Golden Dragon's Den or Altered Fate means you're spending a lot of mana just to cycle your hand and give yourself card advantage, which is really slow. If you combine it with cards like Dragon Snoot and Shenlong, you're at least spending 3 mana on the card advantage while also improving your board. So discard Dragoncraft really needs more minion based discard, so you aren't spending tons of mana and losing tempo at the same time. So to sum up, the verdict is, this could be good in a Dragoncraft discard deck, but for a Dragoncraft discard deck, we're going to need to see more useful discard minions. And lastly for Dragoncraft, Polyphonic Roar, another amulet, 9 mana. At the start of your turn, summon a Windblast Dragon. And Windblast Dragon you should already know well enough from Shapeshifting Mage. It's a 5/5 with Storm. So this card is basically like a budget Prince of Darkness. Instead of playing a 6/6 on turn 10 and then drawing a Silent Rider, which is an 8/8 with Storm, you're putting down one turn earlier an amulet that does nothing the turn it's played, and then you summon 5/5 Silent Riders every turn thereafter for 0 mana. On the minus side, it's slower, since you don't get the body on the turn it's played, and the dragons are 3 less attack than Silent Rider. But on the plus side, you can play it one turn earlier, and you get an quote extra draw, because you're getting the Windblast Dragon for free, as well as drawing an extra card from your deck. But the pros don't really outweigh the cons. Doing nothing on turn 9 is a huge tempo loss. So you'll probably want to play Prince of Darkness instead of this, and since they gave away Prince of Darkness to everyone, there's really not much reason to play this. If you only have one Prince of Darkness, you might want to put this in your deck just to have an extra chance at drawing a win condition. But this would definitely be the weaker of the two. So verdict is, why not just play Prince of Darkness instead? Moving on to Forestcraft, Elf Girl Lisa. Now you want to pay close attention to the text on this because it's deceptively similar to another effect, and that is it's a 2 mana 2/2. Fanfare, all allied followers can't be damaged by spells and effects until the start of your next turn, which sounds very similar to the effect of can't be targeted by enemies, spells, and effects, but it actually plays out quite differently. Because there's no word targeted, this means that it protects against AoEs and random effects, but it does say can't be damaged, which means effects that don't cause damage do still work, like most of Havencraft's removal, Blackened Scripture, Priest of the Cudgel, Themis' Decree, Execution. Anything that removes a minion without actually damaging it does still work. So despite the similar wording, the effects are quite different. Onto the card though, we have a 2 mana 2/2, which is pretty standard. With a powerful effect, it's cheap enough to combo in the late game, so looking at it in a vacuum, it's a pretty above average card. As for whether or not it will see play is hard to say, because like I've said before, a lot of these cards for Forestcraft are like later game cards than the normal current combo forest you see on ladder right now. But Forestcraft has been getting a lot of later game cards in this expansion, so you might see like a later game combo Forestcraft. So the verdict is it's a above average card with a powerful effect. It might see play in a later game Forestcraft combo deck, but we'll have to wait and see. Next, Yule the Ancient, 4 mana 3/4, with no effect when it's unevolved. When you evolve it, at the end of your turn, deal 1 damage to a random enemy follower 2 times. So the first thing to note is the evolve effect is not a one-time evolve effect. It does proc every turn. The other thing to note is that this is a 4 mana evolve. As a 4 mana evolve, it has to be compared to Elven Princess Mage. Elven Princess Mage gives you the 2 free fairies, which enable combo. Yule, on the other hand, is a more board control centric ability. So you could run both, or you could run one or the other depending on what type of deck you're playing. Now I do think this probably get away with getting +2/+2 instead of +1/+1, because it's like a huge step down from Playful Necromancer, which is very similar to this card. Playful Necromancer, you can obviously aim your 2 damage, and it also synergizes with Soul Conversion, and you can hit face, whereas this one can't do any of those things. But this one does proc every turn, so if it sticks around it can start doing a lot of damage. So it's hard to say, but I think it could probably get away with +2/+2 without being overpowered. So the verdict is, it's got good stats, it's got a decent ability, the effect is completely different from Elven Princess Mage. This card should definitely see play. Next up we have Elf Bard. 2 mana 2/2, whenever another follower evolves, put a fairy into your hand. Everything I've said about this mechanic before applies to this card as well. It's not a very powerful effect, it's 2 mana, which comes in too early for the Evolve Wars. It's not useful. Verdict, there are better cards to put in your deck than this. Alright, on to Havencraft. We have Enstatued Seraph, an 8 mana amulet. Countdown 1, last words, summon an Awakened Seraph. So it's an 8 mana card that does nothing the turn is played. Awakened Seraph better be a pretty good summon. And Awakened Seraph, 8 mana, Countdown 1, last word, summon a Renaissance Seraph. Okay, so it does nothing for 2 turns. Renaissance Seraph, better be worth it. Renaissance Seraph. Countdown 1. Last word, summon a Seraph Lapis, glory be. Well, holy crap, 3 turns later, it still hasn't done nothing. The build-up better be worth it. And Seraph Lapis, glory be. Countdown 1. Last words, win the goddamn game. Well, it's been said many times that Haven doesn't have a win condition of its own, so here it is. Win the game. Doesn't get much simpler than that. In reality, it's a little more complex. 8 mana to do nothing is a huge tempo loss. I'm not going to be one of those people that pretends this takes 4 turns to activate though. Obviously you can combo it with Hallowed Sister Initiate and activate it on turn 9 if you already have those cards in hand. But it's a very flexible combo because even if you don't have all 4 cards, you can just play with what you have, and it's only an inevitability that Seraph Lapis Glory Be will activate eventually. But it's still a difficult card to assess because it is a huge tempo loss. I'm gonna go out on a ledge and give this a verdict of viable though, because Haven does have a lot of stalls available. Even though you're skipping your turn 8, 9, or 10 plus, you do only leave your opponent with a small window to kill you before this activates. You also have the knowledge of knowing how many turns it's going to take to activate based on what countdown reductions you have in your hand, whereas the opponent doesn't know unless you have an empty hand or something like that. So basically they need an Amulet Banishment tool, which is Odin, or they have to rush you down between 1 turn and 4 turns depending on how many countdown reductions you have in your hand. So this could possibly replace Prince of Darkness as the Havencraft win condition. We'll have to see. Next, Forbidden Ritual, a 3 mana amulet. Countdown 1, last words, banish all enemy followers with 2 defense or less. This isn't a bad card. I'm not sure if it can fit into a current Havencraft deck, since they have a lot of good removal. At this rate though, maybe concede Havencraft will be a thing. This is obviously something you'd want to play on turn 3, or close to it. It's not going to get much value in the later game. Verdict is it's probably too niche of an effect to run in your deck, since it's only really useful against aggro decks on turn 3, whereas the current Havencraft removal like Blackened Scripture and Priest of the Cudgel do a decent enough job cleaning that stuff up as it is. Next up, Sky Sprite, 3 mana 2/3, Fanfare, give an allied follower a rush. Now this is a really powerful effect. It's basically evolve without the buff that doesn't cost an evolve point. It's especially good in Havencraft where you're waiting on your amulets to pop, and when they finally do, your opponent usually has a minion advantage on you. Typically you would evolve something in order to keep board control, but this card allows you to do that without using an evolve point. And because Havencraft has the countdown amulets, you don't necessarily have to combo this on the same turn. You could have an amulet from the last turn that pops, and then you just play this on top of it. And as for the stats, 2/3 on 3 isn't bad, so even if you have to play it without the effect, it's still a decent body on turn 3. If you can use this on a bigger minion like the 6/6 dragon, then you can probably kill something on your opponent's side, and then that might force them to use an evolve point to respond to it, putting you ahead on evolution points. So the verdict is it can be a powerful effect. It has a lot of potential. It will most likely see some play. And for Runecraft, we have Summon Ice Golem. 3 mana spell, summon an Ice Golem. An Ice Golem is a 3 mana 5/5 with Ward. But it can't attack, and at the end of your opponent's turn, this follower is destroyed. So it's basically a big beefy taunt to stall for a turn. But it's a spell, it summons a token, and it's a big ward, which gives it synergy in both Spell Boost Runecraft as well as Earthright Path to Purgatory Runecraft. Both decks want to stall. Spell Boost wants spells to play. Earthright Path to Purgatory wants tokens to be destroyed so you can get more shadows. So it doesn't seem bad. As usual though, Rune is my least played class, so I can't really say for certain whether it'll be a good fit. Path to Purgatory Runecraft does seem to get along pretty well with just summoning a ton of Guardian Golems, so maybe it's not good enough. I'm not sure. So the verdict is potentially good. Next up, Crystal Bombarder. 4 mana 3/4. Whenever another follower evolves, spell boost the cards in your hand. So here we have another of those new mechanics whenever another follower evolves. This one though is the first one that actually seems decent. It's 4 mana, which puts it in the Evolve Wars, and spell boosting the cards in your opponent's hand is like the last thing you want to do. So this is an actual real deterrent for your opponent evolving minions. Now, I'm not going to say it's a good card or that it will fit into a runecraft deck, because it really doesn't have much synergy with any runecraft decks. It does spell boost cards in your hand if it gets its proc off, but other than that it's just a vanilla minion, which might be killed by something that's already on the board. But I will say it's one of the best designed cards with the new mechanics so far. The verdict for the card though will have to be that it doesn't really have much synergy, so it probably won't see play. Next up for Shadowcraft, Midnight Haunt, 3 mana amulet, countdown 2. Fanfare, gain 13 shadows. Last words, change your number of shadows to 0. Now, this is a very interesting card. It's obviously a combo card since you lose the shadows 2 turns after you play it. And one of the more obvious combos would be with Deathly Tyrant. You need 20 shadows to activate him, which is rather difficult in a basic Shadowcraft deck. You have 7 shadows before you play this. For 9 mana you can play Midnight Haunt plus Deathly Tyrant all in one turn and deal 20 damage. But it can also be used with other cards as well. Like if it's the late game and you desperately need to activate your Foul Tempest or your Death's Breath or whatever, you can play this and then play that card, and then the next turn you'll have a boatload of shadows to play with. You can just play all your Necromancy because you're going to lose the shadows after that anyway. So it's basically like an emergency tempo boost for 2 turns. You spend the 3 mana at first for the shadows, but then you get to activate a lot of your more powerful cards for the current turn and the turn after. So the verdict is, it's an interesting card, and it will probably see play in some decks. It will definitely see play in Deathly Tyrant decks if that's your sort of thing, but it can be decent even in regular control Shadowcraft decks. Next up, Spirit Cycle, another 3 mana amulet, countdown 2, at the end of your turn draw a card. Whenever you use Necromancy, add 1 to this amulet's countdown. Now I said before that Shadow has pretty decent card draw on its own, between Soul Conversion, Skullcradle Widow, and sometimes Bellringer. But this seems like an amulet that can actually compete with some of those things. You get to keep your minions on the board, and you have a chance at drawing more than 2 cards. So you probably won't run this in every mid-range control Shadowcraft deck, but it is a reasonable alternative to the current options. Just be careful that you plan your turns accordingly, because if you increase the countdown on this, then it will stick around longer than 2 turns, and that might interfere with cards that summon multiple minions like Playful Necromancer, Phantom Howl, or Death's Breath. Overall though, verdict is a pretty decent alternative. It should see some play. And lastly for Shadowcraft, Charon, 5 mana 4/5. With an evolve effect, Necromancy 6, summon a Lich. For turn 5, the Necromancy cost is kinda high. You can get 6 shadows by then, but not always for certain. If you do proc this though, it is a huge evolve effect. A Lich is obviously a 4/4, and this card still gets +2/+2. So you're getting a total of +6/+6 over 2 bodies, which is huge. We did already see a 5 mana evolve card in the set though, Serra Dwen, who summons a recent high-cost evolver that died. I think Serra Dwen is a little more reliable, since she will always summon something as long as something has died. Whereas this, you need 6 Necromancy, which is pretty expensive in a Necromancy deck. But her base stats are still good, she still gets +2/+2. It's a solid card. So for a verdict, it's a simple old good card. Huge effect if you can proc it, still an average card if you don't. Definitely playable. Next up, the Swordcraft Legendary. Alexander, 8 mana 6/7. Rush, can attack an unlimited number of times per turn, but it can't attack the enemy leader, sadly. This is an interesting card for controlling the board in the late game, but as I've said before with White Paladin, Sword doesn't really have control options that it needs to make a control deck, like AoE and good single target removal. It has to rely on neutral cards for that, which aren't very good. I also think this card would be worded better like Giant Sandworm from Hearthstone, where it gets to attack again if it kills a minion. That way you give it Rush, and it can clear the board pretty much the same on the first turn it's played, but then on subsequent turns it can attack the enemy leader. But for right now, the verdict has to be that this is a straight control card, which doesn't really fit into Swordcraft as it stands right now. Maybe one day it'll be in the control deck, but that day isn't today. Next we have Avent Blader, 5 mana 3/4. Fanfare, put 2 random officer cards from your deck into your hand. So we have straight up Fanfare, draw 2 cards, and you pay for that with just -1/-1 over a vanilla minion, which isn't bad. They are guaranteed to be officers though, And starting on turn 6, you generally want your commanders. You want Sage Commander, Otohime, Aurelia, etc. So the usefulness of the cards drawn is questionable, but still card advantage is good. So the verdict is this is a straight up good value card, although the usefulness of pulling officers on turn 5 is questionable. And finally onto the neutral cards. We have Humpty Dumpty, 4 mana 3/3. It evolves into a 3/3 that deals 3 damage to all followers. This is a very powerful effect for a neutral card. The only other neutral AoE is Angelic Barrage. It deals 1 damage to the enemies. This deals 3 damage to both sides of the board, so you probably won't want to use it in a minion heavy deck like Swordcraft, but it is very powerful for other classes. But it does have the setback of requiring an evolve point. Typically you want to play your AoEs when it's a good time to play an AoE, and when it's a good time to play an AoE might not be at the same time that you still have an evolve point left to play. But you do get that AoE and a 3/3 all for just 4 mana, which is very powerful, very efficient. So the verdict is going to have to be, it's very powerful and playable in the right metas and decks, but it might not always be good. And the last card, Spellbook Decryption, a 6 mana spell, draw 3 cards. Now as many people have so obviously pointed out, this is terrible value in Shadowverse. Even in Hearthstone, where you typically pay 1.5 mana for draw a card, there's still Nourish, 5 mana, draw 3 cards. In Shadowverse you typically pay about 1 mana with a rather simple condition, like 2 mana Conscription, draw 2 cards if you have a commander. Or like a 1 mana Ivory Dragon, draw 1 card if you have Overflow, something like that. Then there's also Insight, which is straight up 1 mana, draw a card. Now obviously draw 3 cards for 3 mana would be ridiculous, but they didn't even go with 4 or 5 mana, they went with 6 mana, which is incredibly steep. But all that said, card advantage is very powerful in card games, and making a neutral spell that can be put in any deck to draw 3 cards and making a good value would basically mean that every deck has to run that card. So obviously the design team wanted to avoid that altogether by making this a very expensive, bad value card. So any deck running this has a very, very good reason to include it. So verdict, it's a bad value card. I can't actually see any current decks running it, but maybe at one point there is a deck that needs it, and they will have a very good reason for putting it in. And that's all for now. Only a few more days until the expansion releases. If they reveal more cards officially, then I'll have another video up as soon as I can. Otherwise, I'll do a massive card review once the expansion releases and we see them all. As I said before though, all 109 cards have been revealed and have been fan translated if you want to look those up. And I'll also be doing a mass card pack opening as soon as the expansion launches. So as always, I hope you found this informative and enjoyed the video. Have a good night and tune in again next time.